Hey everyone, welcome to the Prophecy Roundtable. Yeah, it's the three of us. We're still hanging out together. And boy, we're going to have a lot of fun today, I think. Gog and Magog. Now, just to let you guys know, we do check the comments, okay? And some of you seem to like it no matter what we do. Some of you don't seem to like it no matter what we do. And then there's some people that like, can you just get to the point? Or that was really painful to listen to because, hey, we're doing our best. We don't claim to have it all figured out, not by any stretch of the imagination. However, our goal here is to have a lively conversation about the end times. All right. So you got three guys who have spent a lot of time studying the Word of God, and we're passionate about it. And we look forward to talking about these topics. And even sometimes when we may have disagreements, that is okay, because we're trying to sort things out. I remember the first time I went to a Beit Midrash, I was shocked because it was so noisy and disorganized. And I'm like, what's going on here? This isn't how you're supposed to have a Bible study. But people were hanging out together. They were talking, sometimes yelling at each other, what looked like yelling at each other. And what they were doing is they were talking about the Word. And it was great because they would challenge one another. And talking about the Word. And that's kind of what we're doing right now is we are challenging one another. And sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't. And that's all part of the fun.
And sometimes the challenge is not necessarily an opinion we even hold. It's just, I don't want to say playing devil's advocate, but like you said, just discussing other options that other people may believe or seeing even problems with the position we hold. I'm going to be pointing out something and using Commonwealth of Israel theology with Doug tonight and some of his positions and asking him to explain himself.
Ooh, this should be good. All right. Well, without further ado, let's jump into this topic, Gog and Magog. People have heard about this and lots of different opinions. We find this in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. Now, John, you and I have known each other a bit longer than Scott, and we bumped into each other in a conference in 2012 in Dallas, Texas, at the Pre-Trib Rapture Conference. God bless all those people, by the way. But it's interesting how sometimes the Pre-Trib Rapture people put the war of Gog and Magog ahead of the tribulation, ahead of the rapture, I should say specifically. But I would kind of, whatever you think about that is kind of up to you. But I'd love to hear your perspective on kind of what is this? What are some of the main perspectives on this topic?
Yeah, let me not go to the more traditional majority view on Ezekiel 38 and 39. But let me go to the one view. Well, there's actually two other views. There's the preterist view that thinks everything has happened. So I think the way that we can deal with that is we just don't agree with that and move on. We'll just wave goodbye to those guys. Because I don't really want to go down there. There's another view that, and every time I talk about the site, Ezekiel 38, 39, or Gog Magog, I always get an email about, well, it's only one time, and Ezekiel 38 and 39 is at the end of the millennium, and they tie it to the Gog and Magog and Revelation chapter 20, and that presents kind of an interesting problem. Is that, for example, we've talked about Babylon quite a bit. When the Bible talks about Babylon, is it always talking about the exact same thing? Is it always talking about a physical Babylon in modern day Iraq, or is it maybe talking about a spiritual thing? Is it talking about someplace else, depending on the context? And the same thing here. So the interpretation is, well, Ezekiel 38, 39 talks about Gog and Magog, and Revelation chapter 20, verses 7, 8, 9, it talks about Gog and Magog. So they must be the same thing. So all you people who talk about Ezekiel 38 and 39 is having a fulfillment, what we would call in the near term, you're just wrong, because the fulfillment of Gog and Magog happens at the end of the tribulation. Excuse me, at the end of the millennium. So that's the one view. And a lot of good people hold to that view. The view that I sort of had for a lot of my life, since I was raised in a pre-trib church and college and education and that type of thing, is that Gog Magog is a future event. And what was interesting to me, Doug, about that 2012 pre-trib study group conference was, and I heard a pre-trib proponent talking about pre-wrath people, and his comment was, those pre-wrath people, they don't agree on anything, man. They're always arguing with each other. And I can tell you honestly that the most argumentative, divisive conference I've ever been to, and I've been to a lot of conferences, was that 2012 pre-trib study group conference. If you remember, Doug, they were fighting about everything. They agreed on the pre-trib rapture, but right. Everything else was pretty much up for grabs. They were arguing. That was when Jonathan Cahn's book, The Harbinger, was out. Right. And there was some really strong disagreement in the room. I mean, really angry disagreement between people who supported Jonathan Cahn's book and those that thought he was, well, I don't know if they were using the word heretic, but he certainly was a false teacher and didn't know what he was talking about. So the other view of Gog Magog is that it happens sometime within the 70th week or before the 70th week. And those views range for, I think Bill Salas would say that the Gog Magog thing of Ezekiel 38-39 happens at least 3.5 years before the beginning of the 70th week. He bases that on the reference in Ezekiel 38-39 that they burned the weapons from the war for 7 years. So his view is, well, if they're going to burn them for 7 years, we know that at the middle of the 70th week, the abomination of desolation, and they're told to flee, they're going to flee. They're not going to take weapons with them to burn. So therefore, the 7 years has to come before the abomination of desolation. Where it gets a little bit complicated with some of them, and I think Bill's a good friend, Bill would put a gap period in there of some kind. I'm not sure exactly where. Others think that the Gog Magog war is what leads to the rise of the Antichrist and the confirmation of the covenant that begins the 70th week of Daniel. Others have put it early in the 70th week. I have seen some pre-trib teachers that I have a lot of respect for, as great Bible teachers, by the way. One of them, I don't know if I should use his name because he's not here to defend himself. My recollection is he used to think that Gog Magog, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, was the part of what we would call the Armageddon campaign at the end of the 70th, near the end of the 70th week. He has since changed, and now he puts it, I think, before the 70th week. I think Chuck Missler sort of had a view that it could be before the 70th week, shortly before the 70th week, or in the early part of the 70th week. I think our friend Doug Krieger, again, he's not here to defend himself, but I'm sure if he disagrees, he will send me a small book. I asked Doug a question once, and he wrote 2 volumes about a question,
in an email, right? By the way.
Yeah, and then he wrote it into a book. So he's got a lot. He's got the ability to write a lot of words.
That's true. That man can write.
I'm a lawyer, for crying out loud, and I'm impressed by what he does. So, but anyway, he would sort of tie it into that it would happen sometime around the 40 days after the beginning of the 70th week. That allows for the period of the sacrifice and oblation and the ending and those time periods that are mentioned in Daniel. So the view, there are a lot of different views. And so if everybody's coming here saying, well, what's their view? You can sort of, well, let's put it this way. I was asked a question once. I was testifying as I think an expert witness in a trial, and somebody asked me if I was a lawyer, and I said, yeah. And they said, how many lawyers in Columbus? And I said 6,000. he goes, "That's a lot, isn't it?" I said, "Well, listen, I know that if you went to Broad and High Street in downtown Columbus and you threw a baseball in any direction at lunchtime, you're going to hit 50 lawyers easy, any direction you go." And that's the same thing with this Ezekiel 38, 39 thing, I think, is that that you could throw a baseball at any direction and you would hit somebody with a different view of it. So, part of me leans towards the earlier part, that it might be part of some of this war sequences in the early part of the 70th week. But then that the ultimate fulfillment of it would come at the time of near the end of the 70th week. So you're going to talk, I think, Doug, about more towards the other view that we haven't mentioned yet, or the one that I've only briefly mentioned.
Sure. I want to give Scott a chance.
I was just going to say, what about the view that it might be that 38 and 39 might be separated into two separate campaigns or whatever? That's something that there certainly does seem to be some differences in that. As far as 39 goes, I would say, prophesy against Gog. That is, I would say that's definitely at the end of this age, because God's name is no longer profaned. The whole house of Israel, and that's what I was talking with you, Doug, about the Commonwealth theology, and these in chapter 39, sort of like it specifically mentions the house of Israel. And it's after the house of Israel has been gathered back to the land. So that gets, I know it might frustrate some people, but I am seeing that there might be some supernatural type of gathering at the end of this age where we are gathered back to the land, sort of like a second Exodus. So for this prophecy to be fulfilled, the whole house of Israel, meaning Judah and Israel, must be gathered back. How that happens, whether it's a supernatural, kind of like who was the disciple that was taken from one place to another. God can do whatever he wants to do. Yeah, Philip. So, Philip was harpazoed, not to third heaven, but he was taken from one place in this space-time continuum to another. Yeshua, Jesus, was able to somehow just disappear. It's like he, obviously being God, could manipulate the time-space continuum that he created, and he would just disappear and walk through the crowd. So if God wants to bring all of his children back into the land, no matter if we have all the details or if we just haven't figured out the details yet, I see this part happening at the end, and mainly because there's some verses that say, no longer will the nations do these things, and the whole house of Israel, will then be at rest and at peace. So, and I'm speaking mainly of Ezekiel 39. I think it may be talking about two different campaigns, but I'm not dogmatic. I told y'all this, through text messages. I am on this subject. I see the arguments for the Gog Magog war being at the end of the millennium. So I don't think any of us can be too dogmatic on it. It's all going to, follow the cloud.
And before we launch the Doug Hamp drone here, there's one other view that this is pretty popular view in the futurist eschatology community, is that Vladimir Putin is Gog. And it's Russia that comes down and attacks Israel. And there's some things, and you can easily speculate on a prophetic scenario that would fulfill that scenario if you want. Look, and I talk about it some myself because Putin is actively, and Russia is actively involved now. Now, whether they're still going to be around, who knows? But if you sort of speculate on the current state of things, and we know that when these scriptures are prophecy actually comes to be fulfilled, they're going to take place in a real world that exists. So I was looking at I'm doing a talk in Canada, and I've sort of come up with the ACLU about prophecy that I'm seeing more and more: acceleration, convergence, logistics, and understanding. And that's sort of how I'm looking in that framework, because I think sometimes we've just sort of talked about it and said, this is the way it happens. And we don't think about the implications of what we believe. Like when it says that these people come against Israel with a great and mighty army, I see a lot of people too, had a couple guys with Hezbollah get a cold and sneeze, and everybody says Ezekiel 38 is happening tomorrow. There's a logistical aspect to it. So now I'm droned on. I'll turn it over to Doug.
No, it's okay. I love the conversation. I remember back in 2005 when Ahmadinejad, the leader of Iran, was saber rattling like nobody's business. And I was a pre-tribber back then, okay? And I held to the view that Gog and Magog were going to come before the rapture and hence before the tribulation. And so I was like, man, we're out of here any second. And well, of course, that didn't happen. Since that time, I have done more research, and I think I have dug deeper. And I don't claim to have the final answer, but I do believe that there are some clues that could give us some really beneficial perspectives. And I just wanted to start with this. This is in Ezekiel 38, verse 17. Thus says the Lord God, are you he of whom I have spoken in former days by my servants, the prophets of Israel, who prophesied for years in those days that I would bring you against them? Now he's speaking here of Gog. Where in the Bible does God speak of Gog? Okay, we have this one reference in Revelation 20. That's certainly after Ezekiel's day. And then we have a reference to somebody has this name, at least Magog, in the book of Genesis. But otherwise, nobody has the name Gog. All right, it's just not there. So in my new book, yes, my new book. One of the comments, somebody said, stop talking about your new book. And what's my show? I get to talk about my new book. Anyway, check out the new book, guys. It's really great. In there, I talk about I go back and I look at the Sumerian language a lot, and I've made some crazy discoveries. All right. Crazy in the sense that they shocked me. I was like, wow, that's pretty wild, And what I discovered, I'll just keep it a long story short here. Basically, Gog is Sumerian, and it means enmity or enemy. All right. So the word means enemy. Right. And if you start understanding, enemy, or technically enmity, and it could also be related to the word arrow, to the Sirius, the dog star. It's related to Ninurta. It's related to quite a few things. It's related to Og, King Og of Bashan. Related to a lot of different things, which I'll talk about in Corrupting Image 3. All right, it's coming. But this what it does is it shows that it's talking about the one who is the enemy. Who is the enemy par excellence in the Bible? Well, it's Satan, of course. We know this back in Genesis chapter 3. God says, I will cause enmity between you, Satan, and the woman, between your seed and her seed. All right, so that's where this enmity begins. And this is the one that God has spoken of for all these years. Again, right? You're the one that I spoke of in former days by my servants, the prophets of Israel. Look, when you look through any of the prophets of Israel, only Ezekiel speaks about Gog. All right, so this is the thing. Now, it's somewhat of a misnomer. We say Gog and Magog, but that's kind of a misnomer, right? This guy Gog, this enemy guy, he's from the land of Magog. All right, now, they do sound the same. That probably is not significant as far as I can tell, but whatever, but so he's from this particular land, but Magog is a place, it's a land, and it's probably somewhere in Turkey, as best I can tell. So then we have to, of course, try to understand. Now, when I was a pre-tribber and I was believing that Ezekiel 38 and 39 were going to happen before the rapture and before the tribulation, I came to verse 2, and I saw here it says the Prince of Rosh. And as many people have suggested, we're talking about what I thought was talking about Russia. Rosh equals Russia. That's what I heard, and that's what I believed. It made sense in my mind. Okay. Now, again, having gone back and looked at these ancient languages, and when you go back to Sumerian, you can't go back any further. That's the cool thing about Sumerian. You're like at ground zero linguistically. There's nothing to go back to. So, and of course, Sumer means Shinar. Shinar, Sumer, same thing. Shinar is Mesopotamia. This is where Nimrod established his kingdom between the two rivers in the land of Shinar, which is Mesopotamia. All right, so that's should we call it eschatological ground, ground zero? Okay, I'm trying to get my words here. All right, ground zero. So that's about as far back as you can go. That really is. So the word Rosh, it's again looking at one of the epithets for Ninurta, who is Nimrod. It's amazing that his name was Sag-Ush. Sag means this, your head. Okay, and one of his other titles was Pabil-Sag. He was the ancient, he was the first primary ancestor. Okay, so when you start understanding that, he was also known as Saturn. You find him in Amos 5:26, where it talks about your king and the image of your king, the star of your king. These are all related. I know it's a lot of different threads, but they're all related as to how they go back to speaking about Nimrod or Satan. When I say both of these, what's hard for me to sort of to abbreviate, I'm trying to abbreviate here, is that Enlil and Ninurta were basically one and the same. They merged. So Ninurta was thought of as the son of Enlil. Enlil is Satan. And then the biblical name for Ninurta is Nimrod. And we see that in Genesis chapter 11, or chapter 10, where Nimrod became a Gibor. I wrote a book about that, so I won't talk about it now. Anyway, the point here is that there really is a merging between these two. So when you talk about Ninurta, you're talking about Enlil. Enlil is really Ninurta. When you talk about Satan, you're talking about Nimrod. Right? They're not exactly the same, but they're close enough. So basically what we have here is that Gog is the enemy. He is enemy number one. He's the one. And once you understand that he's talking about Satan or Satan's avatar, Nimrod, then you're like, oh, so this is who you've been talking about. This is who all the prophets were talking about. Now it makes sense when we understand what Ezekiel is saying there, that he has been talking about this person for a very long time. And then when we start doing a little comparison between this passage and the book of Revelation, well, there we find all kinds of similarities. For example, they're both going to come at a time of peace and security. They both have the same coalition of nations. They both are going to take spoil, loot, and plunder. They both, the beast in Revelation and Gog, they're both destroyed at the end of the battle. Right? We see this in Ezekiel 39:11 and in Revelation 19:20. And there's so many other passages I won't talk about right now, but their armies are confused and attack one another. This is really cool. Ezekiel 38:21 through 22 and Zechariah 14:12 and 13. They both end with a great earthquake. The mother of all earthquakes is going to happen in both of these battles, right? It's amazing. They both experience great hailstones. They're both followed by the feast of God, where he invites the birds to come and have a little feast on these guys. And then afterwards, you have the weapons of war are destroyed, Ezekiel 39:9, and also Isaiah 2:4, where they're going to beat their plows or their swords into plowshares. And then after both of these battles, God's name will no longer be profaned. And after both of them, it says that it is done. So, this is just a partial list of some of the reasons that, biblically, these are one and the same event. Then if we start looking at a lot of the rabbinic understanding of this, and also Second Temple pseudepigrapha, you find that they were definitely understanding that this would be that this is the enemy par excellence. So Gog is basically a cipher for the enemy that's destined to attack Israel, leading up to the Messianic age. So we see in some of the different literature, when they witness the war of Gog and Magog, he will say to them, "Against whom have you come?" They will say, "Against the Lord and against his anointed." In Targum Neophiti, we see it says, Eldad and Medad promise that in the end of the days, Gog and Magog will come up against Jerusalem with their army and will fall by the hand of King Messiah. And on the list goes, right? So this is, again, I'm just highlighting a few things that are about how these are one and the same from the Bible's perspective. They're one and the same from the rabbinic perspective. I mean, obviously, they didn't believe in the book of Revelation, but they understood that the war of Gog and Magog would be the definitive end times war. We would call it Armageddon. They wouldn't use that term, but we're talking about the great day of the Lord, the battle of the Lord Most High, which we see in Isaiah chapter 2. We see it in Isaiah chapter 13. We see it in Isaiah 24. We see it in Isaiah 63. I'll tell you, it's all throughout Isaiah. It's amazing. We see it big time in Joel chapter 1, 2, and 3. We see it in portions of Malachi. This thing is all over the place. Hosea, Habakkuk chapter 3, and many, many, many more. This is the battle that God is going to wage against the enemy. So by doing the linguistic research, I think I've been able to decipher that, this is talking about the enemy. Now, whether Russia's involved or China, I think those are all fantastic questions. And I'm not saying that they can't be part of that. I always want to be very, very careful when I try to connect the prophecy to a specific person or to a specific country. I find that quite often it's just a dangerous gamble. And so I really try not to do that. Because, it's dangerous. So anyway, I'm going to open it back up for conversation here. We can look at more scriptures in detail if you want to, but I want to hear your guys' reactions.
Well, so Doug, let's look at how, because I'm sure I've got presentations somewhere on my computer that has a slide that says why Ezekiel 38, 39 is different from Armageddon. Armageddon, they come from the whole earth. But Ezekiel 38 and 39 seems to indicate that they just come from certain specific geographic regions. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. When you start looking at the list of places that are mentioned, it's really interesting that they pair up so incredibly well with the Table of Nations. So I've actually put a little table together, and when you look at Ezekiel 38, so you've got the land of Magog, you have Meshech, Tubal, Persia, Cush, Put, Gomer, Bet Togarma, and many people are with you. Okay, so it's not only limited to those countries, but those are the ones that are mentioned. And then when you compare that with Genesis chapter 10 and the Table of Nations, he talks about Gomer, Magog, Tubal, Meshech, Togarma, Tarshish, Cush, Put, Sheba, Dedan, Elam, which is Persia. All right, so a lot of the same countries, or the names of these, the fathers of these countries, if you will, are mentioned. And so what I would suggest is that the Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10 is laying out the basic people groups. Now, granted, those people groups have expanded. Sometimes they've expanded their border. Sometimes they've just plain moved their country. But we're talking about the same basic people groups. All right. So when Ezekiel 38 essentially says these are the peoples, and then we find those people in the Table of Nations, I would say that's the people, right? Because obviously we all came from the Table of Nations, right? There was no America a long time ago, but we all came from the Table of Nations one way or another.
I was going to, again, I see as far as Ezekiel 39 goes, 100% sort of on board with your argument, because again, you have it's sort of like this feast that's in Revelation, where we're celebrating the marriage feast with our bridegroom. We're the bride. The kings of the earth, the vultures and the carrion and the birds of prey of the earth, they're having their feast. And so you certainly see these parallels in Ezekiel 39. The problematic verse that has always been problematic in trying to put Ezekiel 38 either pre-trib or during the final 7 years of this age or shortly before the very end of this age, the one that I think is the biggest problem is it says that Israel is dwelling in safety. They're without walls. That certainly looks to be more like the Revelation Gog and Magog war at the end of the seventh day, at the end of the millennium, where there's not going to be any weapons in the millennium. I can see how, Satan is released, and all these people who've been harboring rebellion, that just shows you even under perfect righteous rule and reign, even when Satan is chained for his 1,000 years, it shows you that man's heart, unless changed by God, is rebellious, and people are going to want to sin, and they're going to like, we don't want this rule, so they're going to throw in their lot with Satan, and at that time we do know that it will be a city without armaments. There will be 1,000 years of peace at that time. So that's why, again, and I'm not dogmatic on this, I do see certain clear distinctions between Ezekiel 39 and 38, because in Ezekiel 39, if it happens earlier in this age, then you've got to deal with those passages that say, that and all Israel is following, and my name's not profaned. And I don't think that happens during these final 7 years of this age, because there's going to be a lot of profaning going on. The beast is going to be being given that authority for those 42 months. And so he's certainly going to be profaning until judgment falls at the end of this age. So that's why I do believe Ezekiel 39 is what we mostly refer to as the Battle of Armageddon. When the Lord returns and wipes everything out, grabs the beast and the false prophet, throws them into the lake of fire, and chains Satan up for 1,000 years. And that's when not off topic, but that's when the resurrection occurs, and so that's I do see Ezekiel 39 happening at the end of this age. Ezekiel 38 is more tricky because they're dwelling in safety. Even if we look just at Judah, the Jews living in Israel right now, they ain't dwelling in safety. I mean, they've got rockets.
Well, I think you could read that differently. So you're talking about Ezekiel 38:8, and now dwell securely all of them. All right. Wow. So
I did a word search today. You look at that exact passage. No, what I'm saying is, I looked in that in Jeremiah and other places, and again, it's almost the same parallel language that talks about, again, once the Lord returns and sets up the millennium, that's when we will dwell in safety. And it is, I didn't create a chart or anything, but if you just if you use your BLB app and click on safely, and then you look at where it's quoted in other parts of Ezekiel and Jeremiah, and there's a consistent theme there, dwell in safe. And I just don't think that's until the end of this age. That's when it starts.
Right.
And
well, I mean, we don't. First of all, I think when we look at the text, what we see is that this is a people that has been brought back, and so he says, in the latter years you will come into the land of those brought back from the sword. Boy, if World War II and the Holocaust does not qualify as people brought back from the sword. I don't know what could possibly do that. Also, it says that it's a land that has long been desolate. There were 660,000 days of no rain in Israel, and this was noted in history. Nachmanides noted this in around 1260 AD. He went to the land and he couldn't find 9 other Jews to have a minyan with, a quorum. He just couldn't do it to pray with them. And he noticed how devastated the land was. And he actually said, this is a good thing because, while we're in exile, God is not letting the land really be inhabited. He's not letting it do its thing. So now you have a people that are brought back from the sword. I am convinced that is talking about the return of the Jewish people in 1948. All right. So, secondly, as far as living in safety, so really what this means, lavetach literally means for the security. All right. And the security forces of Israel are known as the bitachon, malechet habitachon, and this is a term that referring to their security. All right. So we, safely, you think that there's no danger whatsoever, but that is the same idea. It really means to feel safe, right? So it could be something. It could be something that you are safe, or it could just be that you feel safe. Yeah, go ahead.
Let me read these passages. Okay, so Jeremiah 23:6. In his days Judah shall be saved, and Israel shall dwell safely, and this is his name whereby he shall be called the Lord our righteousness. Jeremiah 32:37. Behold, I will gather them out of all countries, whither I have driven them in mine anger and in my fury and in great wrath. And I will bring them again into this place, and I will cause them to dwell safely. 33:16. In those days Judah shall be saved, and Jerusalem shall dwell safely. And this is the name whereas she shall be called the Lord our righteousness. So my point is, those passages, when we look at those in context, those have not been fulfilled yet. And so again, I do believe that Judah being gathered in unbelief had to occur as a precursor for these other prophecies to be fulfilled. In other words, Judah had to be in the land in order to be able to call out, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Judah has to be and had to be in the land for passages like Zechariah 12, which are entirely 100% Judah-centric as opposed to Ephraim or Israel. They're not even mentioned in Zechariah 12. But when I just look briefly at these passages, like Ezekiel 34:28, and they shall no more be a prey to the heathen, neither shall the beasts of the land devour them, but they shall dwell safely, and none shall make them afraid. In Ezekiel 34:25, I just see all those promises as being future, and I don't see them happening until Yeshua returns. And so I think the strongest argument, I think Chris White made this argument in a book and on a YouTube teaching, and others have made the same, is that at a minimum, Ezekiel 38 appears to more line up with the Revelation Gog and Magog conflict, which is not much of a conflict. It's sort of like Satan rebels, he gathers up the people, they're coming against Jerusalem, and it's game, set, match, like immediately. It's over, it's done with. There's no more rebellion. We're going to the 8th day. We're then going to the eternal state at that point in time. So that's the best I can do with these passages, and be honest with the text without being dogmatic on anything. But I do think Ezekiel 39 is at the end of this age, and maybe Ezekiel 38 is at the end of the next stage. But who knows?
Well,
So
I might agree that the last part of Ezekiel 39 might be at the end, but the other part, I don't think so. The earlier part, I think after verse, I don't have the passage open, after verse 23 or so of Ezekiel 39, I think that might tie in more to the post-millennium Gog and Magog. But I'm pretty sure it happens in this. It's Doug. You did a great job pulling out all the different parallels between the sort of the Armageddon, what we would call the Armageddon scenario in Ezekiel 38, 39. It's a very difficult thing to sequence. Certainly. So I was thinking about some passages today as I'm getting a talk ready. Which I should have had done a couple weeks ago, but these things, these prophecies are fulfilled. They just don't burst out of nowhere. I mean, there's a buildup, just like there's when it says it is, that the invading forces are a great company and a mighty army. You don't build those up overnight. I mean, when we went into Iraq in the first 30 years, was it 30 years ago? Yeah. The first Iraq war, the Kuwait thing.
Yeah.
That was a lot. That was a lot of things happened there.
Totally.
Since then. But anyway, we're, certainly the United States is the most powerful army in the world at the time. And it was a 6 month, buildup to take out a pretty ragtag, what turned out to be a pretty ragtag army. So it's not, there's going to be a big buildup. I think we're going to see the foundations of it being laid. And I agree with you, Doug, on the land of Israel was it was desolate. We've all read the passages from Mark Twain, who's, hardly see a person, I hardly saw a bush or a tree in the land back in 1867 or whenever it was that he was there. So it's there, so there's been, like I said, certainly we've seen some things indicate that these things are unfolding. At least any reasonable person would, I think.
It seems like it. Scott, let me just answer your question about the whole idea of lavetach. So this is about security, right? So this is from Jeremiah 49, verses 30 and 31. Flee, get away, far away. Get far away. Dwell in the depths, O inhabitants of Hazor, says the Lord, for Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, has taken counsel against you, speaking of Hazor, and has conceived a plan against you. Arise, go up to the wealthy nation that dwells securely, says the Lord, which has neither gates nor bars, dwelling alone. So that's the same linguistic phrase there, lavetach, that is used in Ezekiel 38:8, right? And even in Israel themselves. I mean, I read something from the Times of Israel where this woman was saying that, we Israelis, we have a different sense of safety. You Americans think that it has to be, I don't know, it has to be utopia before it's safety, but they don't grow up feeling that way. They grow up that, thinking that I'm going to be okay today. There's all these good reasons why I'm going to be okay. Right. So it's a sense of well-being, whether it's real or just perceived. It's still that sense of, we're going to be okay. We are safe. And I think most Israelis, while they understand that there are conflicts, or should I say, there are issues that came up. Look, I lived in Israel for 3 years. And when I was there, I think there were 2 or 3 bombings. Right? I remember this one, Sabaro, was just blown to bits, man. It was crazy. But you know what? They didn't talk about it. They quickly cleaned it up. I mean, it was cleaned up in a matter of hours that you could barely tell. They boarded it up and they started rebuilding that thing lickety split. All right. And they did not let that stop them or scare them. Right. So yes, there's danger, but just because there's danger doesn't mean that you don't feel safe. Right. Especially as we see in Scripture. I'm not saying that modern Israel is this today, but in Scripture, when you see people that are trusting in the Lord, danger can be all around them, but they're dwelling safely or securely because they know where their hope comes from. Now, I would say modern Israel probably is not too much depending on God per se. They're probably depending on their technology, their military, etc., to keep them safe. And so here you have a scenario where Gog who's the enemy. Remember, He's the enemy. That's what his name means. The enemy is going to come against Israel in the latter days. I mean, let's look at some of the terminology that is used about this individual. I mean, this is why I had to change my opinion, because I'm like, there's no way that you can just ignore so many of these things that line up perfectly with the book of Revelation. So first of all, God says that when he comes, that my fury will show on my face. Oh my goodness. I mean, where do we see this? Well, we see this. I'm going to put on my cross references here, but we see this in, well, it's not showing me. Anyway, Revelation 6, verse 17, I think it is, right? So hide us from the face of him who sits on the Lamb. And there's so many other passages that speak about God's face. We have in Habakkuk chapter 3, where the Lord Jesus is coming. And it says that he stood and measured the earth. He looked and startled the nations, right? So they're seeing Jesus come and they are scared because they see the fury on his face. And so, again, that's just one of many different perspectives. But here is this fire and jealousy. He's coming in this sense. All the fish, the birds, the heavens, all the creeping things that are on the earth, he's going to shake. Everything is going to shake at his presence. The mountains shall be thrown down. The steep places shall fall, and every wall shall fall to the ground. This is the same language that you have in Isaiah chapter 2. And it's the same language we have in Revelation, throughout the book of Revelation. It's calling about this. Every man's sword will be against his brother. That's in Zechariah that talks about that. And then you have great hailstones, fire and brimstone, all this stuff that is coming against Gog and his troops. Those are the same things that will be coming against the Antichrist in Revelation chapter 16, chapter 19, and other places in the book of Revelation, right? So when this happens, then everyone's going to know who's really in control. Notice he says, I'll knock the bow out of your left hand. What do we see in Revelation chapter 6 with the rider on the white horse? He has a bow in his hand. You know, it's amazing. And then after all this stuff has happened and he has brought judgment upon Israel, it says that he's going to call the birds. I just want to get to this a little bit fast here. So he's going to invite the birds to come, and he's going to tell them, you're going to eat fat till you're full. You're going to drink blood till you're, drunk at my sacrificial meal, which I'm sacrificing to you. Well, we see this exactly in Revelation 19:17. An angel standing in the sun cried out with a loud voice, saying to all the birds that fly in the midst of heaven, come and gather together for the supper of the great God. So we're seeing the same things that are happening. Now, there's obviously a whole lot more, a lot of details in here, and I don't have time to go into all the details, but those are just some of the highlights why I think that you really have to look at it. Now, look, to be fair, one of the things that kept me from believing is saying, well, there's no way that you could burn the weapons and the burying of the bodies and all this stuff, right? Well, actually, if we understand the bigger context of what's going on, and again, I've made the argument that the mark of the beast is a genetic transformation of the person, so that these people become hybrids, they become superhumans or half demon, whatever you want to call them, but they're transformed. And so one of the reasons that the Israelis are going to send out search parties to search for these people is because they may not be fully human. That's what I would suggest. Also, it says that they're going to be buried in this place called Hamon Gog. Hamon means a lot, right? So Hamon Gog is this place of a lot. It will also be known as the Valley of Gog, the Valley of Hamon Gog. And that it says that it's going to obstruct the travelers, which is a really weird thing. But who's traveling where? Well, we see the same thing in Isaiah chapter 66. It says that from one new moon to another and from one Sabbath to another, all flesh will come to worship before me, and they will look upon the corpses of the men who transgressed against me, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. They shall be an abhorrence to all men. That is, I would argue, speaking of the same thing, that Hamon Gog and that this place of the dead bodies in Isaiah 66 are both one and the same place. So I think that these are perfectly, we're perfectly able to put these together. There's nothing that would hold us back from doing so. In fact, I would argue that they have to be the same. And then one last thing, and I'll give the floor back. And that thing is, what about what happens to the millennium? All right. So as I explained, the word Gog, it means enmity or enemy. Okay. So if we understand that Gog just means enemy, and that is Satan par excellence, through his various avatars, after the millennium, guess what? Satan's going to be let out for 1,000 years, or he's going to be let out after the 1,000 years.
Yeah.
He'll be let out for a short time, right? And so guess what? He's back. The enemy is back, right? This isn't a new thing. This is an old thing, but he had been locked up for 1,000 years, and now he's going to be let out of his prison. Okay, I yield. I yield my time.
Go ahead, John.
Well, I tried to share a screen, but I don't know if I can do that.
It's here. Yeah, it's here. Hold on.
Yeah, that's Doug Hamp's brain. That's one of the better graphics I've ever seen. Remember our old friend Chuck Missler used to say that the Bible is an integrated message.
Yes.
And that is all the different books of the Bible showing the interconnections to other books.
Wow. Oh my goodness. That's insanity.
So that's the brain we should all try to have. So I just thought I would point that out, because I do think that the passages explain that. I'll just reiterate what you said about the feeling of security in Israel. I think they do feel secure even today. They have a very well equipped, knowledgeable security apparatus and military. Look at some of the things that they do. The attack on the Iranian nuclear facility which had to be an attack underground at Natanz just this past week. That took out some of their, at least shut down the power that they needed to run their centrifuges to purify uranium in Iran. So, and when you walk around, you see the young soldiers walking around everywhere, on the bus, on the whatever that light rail thing is they have. I forget what they call it. Carrying what our president would call weapons of war. And so there is a feeling of security everywhere you go. They live in a highly secure environment. There are restrictions, but they do have that feeling of security. And I do think that what the passage there is referring to is more of a feeling of security than an actual, because they feel that way even though they live in the midst of a lot of people that would like to get rid of them.
Yeah, well said. Scott.
Doug, how do you, again, we are both on the same page with the Commonwealth of Israel and how the house of Israel is treated distinctly from the house of Judah. Sometimes it can get confusing because sometimes the whole house of Israel refers to Judah and Israel. But when you start looking at the end of Ezekiel 39, like let's say, verse 25, therefore, this is what the Lord God says. Now I will restore the fortunes of Jacob and have mercy on all the house of Israel. And I will be jealous for my holy name. And I will not hide my face from them any longer, for I have poured out my spirit on the house of Israel, declares the Lord. And that's very specific. The way Ezekiel uses, because he'll also use the house of Judah. Jeremiah does the same thing. And it just in what I'm preparing right now for for our boot camp for the Commonwealth of Israel, our kind of introductory training, that's really what I'm doing right now, is going through and looking at the division of Israel initially. When Jacob after wrestling with God and receiving the promises, well, he keeps the kids divided, and then Joseph is divided from his brothers by his brothers. And then we see all these distinctions. So the latter part of especially chapter 39, and the house of Israel will know that I am the Lord their God from that day onward. The nations will know that the house of Israel went into exile for their wrongdoing. We're still in exile. I am of the house of Israel. I don't think I'm of the house of Judah. And because they were disloyal to me, hid my face from them, so I handed them over to their adversaries, and all of them fell by the sword. Unlike Judah, Ephraim and those 10 tribes have never, ever been gathered back to the land. Judah was. They won't even let us Ephraimites, Manassites, Danites, or grafted in Israelites be citizens of Israel right now, even if we wanted to be. And we say, no, we're Israel too. No, you're not Jew. And so I think in interpreting this passage, you have to take into account the house of Israel, and we're still in exile. So it kind of goes to your point in sort of proving that this cannot happen until the house of Israel is gathered back. And it's just so common in these discussions. I listened to one or two, and actually I do listen to a lot of pre-trib dispensational guys still. And, it was, and Israel was gathered back in 1948, and they're just looking at just the Jews as Israel. Whereas, so how, I think it proves your point, but it seems like there's got to be some type of gathering of Israel.
I totally agree. I totally agree. And so it gets a little bit complicated, I think, because we have a lot of theological pieces that need to be understood, right? And it's not easy to jump into this without background. Okay, so for those that don't know, Scott and I are very much on the same page that we believe that the house of Israel that we're talking about, that we are grafted into the commonwealth of Israel. We get this from Ephesians chapter 2. Let me just pull up a different translation here. So now at that time, you, speaking of Gentiles, knowing that you were without Christ, have now been brought near. Excuse me. Now that you've been, sorry, let me try again. All right, remember that you once Gentiles in the flesh, which are called uncircumcision, that at that time you were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers from the covenants of promises, right? So we're no longer strangers from those covenants of promise, but we're no longer strangers and foreigners, but we're fellow citizens. So that's the basis of my and Scott's understanding on this issue. So when we have all this, what I would suggest, Scott, is that here God is saying, look, after I've done all of this, after I have dealt with Gog, then the Gentiles, everybody will know, the Gentiles, the nations will know that the house of Israel went into captivity. Now, I completely agree that the house of Israel here is not the house of Judah. But guess what? Just 2 chapters before this, what do we see? We see a incredible passage of where we have 2 sticks, and we have, and fair enough, the two trees. Thank you. We also, of course, have the valley of the dry bones, right? So this is so typical of God. What he's doing is he is giving snapshots. Let's talk about this scene right here. Then let's talk about this scene, right? So he builds the set for us. Here, study this for a minute, and then
goes back and forth.
Yeah, and then we'll see where to put it into the big story. Whereas I think for many of us in sort of the Greek Western mindset, we're like, well, first A, then B, then C, then D, and I don't see it that way at all. In fact, in the paper that I just sent you guys, which I'll publish as soon as I can, but I called it a thematic understanding of the book of Revelation. I talk about a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? So the thematic approach is that you take your peanut butter and jelly sandwich and you just take a bite out of it, right? You have bread, peanut butter, jelly, bread, all at the same time. Whereas I would say that the chronological understanding would say, first I'm going to eat my piece of bread, then I'm going to have a spoon of peanut butter, then I'll have another spoon of jam, and then I'll have that other piece of bread. That's the chronological position or understanding. And I'd say we have to see them all together. And so what we have then is not to understand all of it in a strict chronology. There's a little bit, I don't deny that, but not so much in a strict chronology where you say, well, Ezekiel 37 has to come before Ezekiel 38 and 39. I just don't see it that way. But go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that since just in the, I mean, it's just been in the past 3.5 years that I now see prophecy in that respect. So I'm no longer beating my head against a wall trying to make square pegs of the Bible fit into a round hole. When you start to look at that thematic approach, and I know you view Revelation thematically, I can view it thematically. It's a pattern. In other words, I think John even mentioned this in his prophecy update this past week, is that biblical prophecy is a pattern, which is moving from the beginning to the end, but the end is declared at the beginning. And just our mindset, our Western mindset, is not trained that way. And one of the guys I listened to was his little mini teaching Perry Stone did on Gog and Magog. And he was arguing that the dry bones and all that and everything was fulfilled in 1948 and in 1967. And then he, so he's trying to still make all the pieces fit, saying that, can a nation be born in one day? I think that's Isaiah 65 or 66. And they'll pick out that one little verse, but then when either read before then and read after that, and there's no way that prophecy has been fulfilled. They've picked out. I would agree with that. I mean, it's. I think Judah coming back into the land, and I'll say it again, it was a precursor that had to happen, and they had to be brought back in unbelief in order for prophecy to be fulfilled. So I don't look at at Judah, the Jews coming back into the land post World War II as just some Rothschild conspiracy, and I've seen even comments in the section about calling them Ashkenazi Jews. I mean, that's just Satan within our community, especially those Jewish people who do believe they're Jewish, whether they're Jewish or not. Shut up. It doesn't matter. Who cares? God's got it all figured out. He'll sort it out. And I do see this anti-Jewishness arising, sadly, in what I don't identify myself as the Hebrew roots movement, because I see so many negative anti-Jewish comments by people. They've had a revelation that, oh my goodness, we're not the church. We actually are part of and in Israel. And next thing you know, they start kicking Judah to the curb.
That's right. I know, it's terrible.
It's so frustrating that it's like they see a little bit of light, and then they see the shiny, racist, anti-Semitic object over here on the right, and they bust hell wide open into that ditch. I mean, it's like, come on, people, can't we just love each other and get along? And this is a lawyer talking. Okay? Look at John. I mean, what a love.
Scott, I agree with you. I see this. I don't know if anti-Semitism is the correct term. This anti-Judah, anti-Israel sentiment. It's coming from many, many quarters. I was listening to a internet guide just today, and goodness gracious, it was enough to want to throw the radio through the wall, because it was just this rant about Jews and Zionists and all this stuff that was it was awful. It was just terrible. So I see that rising in a lot of different quarters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do too, John. And it's very disheartening. Just for our community, so we're very much pro-Jewish. We don't think they know everything. We don't think they're perfect. We don't worship them. But we will stand by them. We don't think that they're the enemy. Have there been conspiracies? Maybe. I don't know. Sure. Okay. But you know what? God's doing his thing. And he's bringing together the house of Judah and the house of Israel. That's the important part. And it's so true that what you're saying, Scott, I completely see it. People come into Hebrew roots. I'm going to keep the Sabbath and keep the feast. Great. but I hate the Jews now. Like, what are you talking about? That's wrong. Don't do that. You've missed the point here. It's to come together, because God is going to bring these two trees back together. Thank you. You're reforming me. I appreciate that. So what's
we were
anyway.
brought together. We were brought together. Romans 11 makes that clear. You have this natural cultivated olive tree that was Judah, because that never lost its identity. Then you had these wild olive trees. They were still olive trees. That's your house of Israel. Now, anybody, and it talks about those two trees becoming one, the wild being grafted into the natural. So you've got a single tree, which is all Israel, with the root being Messiah. And it doesn't matter about DNA or anything. It doesn't matter if you've got any Ephraim in you or any Judah in you. Quit worrying about the DNA, although there's truth to it. People can get sidetracked onto it and go off into crazy nonsense. And then you get into British Israelitism, and you get into Black Hebrew Israelite racist stuff. And then my concern is I'm just seeing a lot of people that they come into this, and then they all of a sudden they want to throw Judah under the bus. And next thing you know, they're driving all over the Jews. And then they start running all over our Baptist and Methodist and Presbyterian brothers. And I'm like, guys, come on. You teach the truth. We can differ. And like I like to say, you're allowed to be wrong, or you're allowed to convince me that I'm wrong, or we can just agree to disagree. But it's amazing on this subject. I had some clients in my office today, and we just started talking, and her dad just started going, wait a minute. Why am I not observing the Sabbath? And he's like a 60-something-year-old carpenter. And so I do believe prophetically we have Judah, Israel, the modern nation state of Israel, taking over the Temple Mount and Jerusalem in 67. And it just so happened that about that time, that's when sort of more and more Jewish people about that time started to place their faith in Messiah, into Jesus. And then they started they said, no, we don't have to join the church. We can remain Jewish. We can still do some of our Jewish traditions, and they can. Some of the things I think they should drop, just like some of the things the church should drop.
Amen.
But with them coming in and saying, no, we can believe in Jesus and not have to become Christians. We don't have to do Easter. We can do Passover. I think that God has used that and used those Jews that have been brought in to have an influence on the church. And now the church, a lot of the people are saying, well, wait a minute, some of this stuff, and it's all prophetic. On this topic, I just see that God is using this movement, this return back to those ancient ways, is something that we do see in prophecy. And how the house of Israel, those of us who do, all three of us, we all are former Gentiles. We're of the flesh. We are Gentiles, but we are now, no longer excluded from the Commonwealth of Israel. So, I mean, nobody denies that. Even dispensationalists don't deny that. They try to spiritualize it. I'm like going, no, it's both. It's real. I'm flesh.
Yeah.
So, and
Well
spirit.
said.
So,
Any thoughts, John?
Well, that's a pregnant pause there. Waiting for it to give birth. I agree with you that this, well, Scott, I've used the term grafting in for a long time, that we're grafted into this tree. I've seen some pre-trib friends who will say, well, we're grafted in, but we're removed in the rapture, so the natural branches can be grafted back in again. And I thought, well, God could make a pretty big tree, I think, and have room to graft all the natural branches. And it's a wonderful analogy, by the way, the olive tree, that it's probably the one plant that a branch can be removed and set aside for a very, very long time and be grafted back in and bear fruit again.
That's very interesting.
And it's all about trees. You get the oil, which oil, is representative of the Ruach, of the Holy Spirit. And to get that oil, we fruit must be crushed. And we're we're pruned when God takes away our fleshly bits, which is never, sometimes you're like, God, prune me, but can you just, can you give me more of a summer pruning as opposed to, because pruning, you look at a pruned plant and it looks ugly at first, and that's sort of the same analogy. And I do believe that's why God chose the olive tree. And what, can they live 2,000 years? Is it like the oldest one, John, like 2,000 years old?
I think that's theoretically possible. Really.
So, and here we are, almost. Anytime somebody says, "in 2,000 years ago," it's almost like a little pet peeve. Now I go, it's not been quite 2,000 years. And 2,000 years ago, Paul wrote. I'm like, no. It's like that was like 1,985 years ago, or 1,980 years ago, or same thing with Jesus. And 2,000 years, no, it hasn't been 2,000. Nobody believes it's been 2,000 years yet.
Well, we're always rounding up.
There you go.
I know, and I think we're 7.4 years to 12.4 years away from 2000. So we shall see.
Yeah. So, boy, we're out of time. I'd love to just kind of maybe summarize some of I'll summarize my views, and you guys, if you want, you can summarize your views. Sure. So I'm absolutely convinced that Gog, the so-called Gog and Magog war, are the same as Armageddon. Again, that is coming in Corrupting Image Volume 3. I'm working on that as fast as I can. But one of the things that really unlocked it for me was understanding the meaning of Gog, that it means enmity. And I'm getting that from Sumerian. Okay. And there's all kinds of these other just incredible things that are like, wow, that's really amazing. Anyway, so we're talking essentially about Satan, or a merging, a hybridization of Satan and his avatar, whom we would call the beast. The beast and Gog are the same individual. The beast is acting as if he were completely Satan. And he is going to be the one who will come against Israel in the last days. We saw that in a lot of the Jewish rabbinic understanding, Second Temple understanding. This is what they wrote about as well. And then, just the same judgments that happen in Ezekiel 38, 39 are the same judgments that we find specifically with the Battle of Armageddon in Revelation. We also see those same things in the book of Isaiah and many other places. So yeah, I had to change my opinion that it was somehow something before the rapture, that this is now going to be an event that will happen at the end of the tribulation, or you could argue after the tribulation, but it'll happen at the very end of that 70th week. And Jesus coming back is how Gog will be defeated.
Go ahead, John.
Well, I'm still bouncing back and forth between the two, but I'm becoming more and more convinced that it's part of what we would call the Armageddon scenario. I think it fits a little bit better. Maybe it fits a lot better than the others. Again, my objection to some of my friends is that they hold the doctrine of imminency in very high esteem, to the point that everything becomes imminent. Ezekiel 38 and 39 and this and the mark and all of these things. And it'll unfold in due course and in the right timing. We don't have to ramp it up all the time. Doug, I think you've talked about this in the past, that we sort of get on this adrenaline rush of, oh, this is it. And maybe, obviously, it's not been it yet so far. So I think we need to, just dial it back sometimes. And here's the guy who talks about things going on all the time, is sort of setting things up. So, but we have to be careful, I guess.
Yeah, but
Well said.
John, you're not a sensationalist, dude. That's like I say, you don't try to sensationalize everything.
I'm sensational.
Oh, you are
Sensationalist,
sensational.
yeah.
Sensational looking, sensational golfer, legal mind.
I'm awesome.
But when it comes to trying to make every current event, and I see that constantly with prophecy teachers, that it's almost like they're trying to get YouTube views or hits on their website. Everything is imminent. Everything
it's the tyranny of the problem that we have when we talk about these things, look at them, is the tyranny of the urgent. You've got to deal with this. And so sometimes people will say, why haven't you talked about this yet? Why don't you do a midweek update? And my response usually is, I'd rather be, rather than being first, I'd rather be right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and on these subjects, again, you cannot help but look at, and we were talking about maybe doing a geopolitical current events. You cannot help but look at what is going on in the world geopolitically through a lens of prophecy during the time you're living in it. But there have been, and that's what people like to use against individuals like myself and the two of you and others that think we are getting close to the end of the age. They go, well, people have been saying this since the 1500s or since, the 2nd century. And I just like to say that, look, all these things, Judah being gathered back into the land, the potential for a one world government that can actually be enforced, the potential for a one world system, so many events converging at this time. And the main thing, and I promise you, for 30 years, when this type stuff would come up and they would go, this is it. I'm like, we're not even close to the end of the second day. We're not even close to year 2000. And I've been very dogmatic on that as far as things not happening until then. And so far it's proven out correct. And so, and that's something that I'm talking to my older son about, is he thinks I'm crazy, and I'm okay with that. But he says, Dad, people have always said that. I said, Noah, we haven't even been close to 2 days the way God counts days. And we are getting close. And 2020 with COVID stuff, and what we are seeing with some of these geopolitical things in Iran, Persia, what we're seeing in the world with China, it's you can't help but see that and view it through that lens. But what I appreciate about you, John, is you like you say, you don't sensationalize it like it's going to happen tomorrow or next month or even next year. You're just keeping your eyes on things and informing the public, and that's where I get my news these days. And I figure if it's important enough, you'll let me know, because I rarely ever watch news.
So I sort of view it as a wave, that it crests and it goes back a little bit, but it never goes back as low as it was before. It kind of keeps ramping up, and I think you need. I think we need to understand that. I mean, if you don't realize this, I think we would all agree, we live in a really weird world now.
Yeah.
I got an email we had a shooting of a young man who was arrested and taken to the hospital and then resisted arrest and had a weapon and got shot and killed. And so they're erecting barricades around City Hall, Columbus. And, we're sort of getting words that you should not go downtown. And this is Columbus, and I'm down there the other day. There's nobody around. I'm driving by office buildings that are completely empty, that are perfectly good buildings. And yet at the same time, I have a realtor friend. She put a house on the market a couple of days ago, and in a day and a half, she had 72 showings.
Wow.
And other people saying, people next door put their house on the market and they have 60 showings the next day. They said there's lines of people on the street wanting to get in to see the house to buy. And everything is just crazy and upside down. So as we finish up, look, I think this is an area of study, and as I've always said, the best evidence of how prophecy is going to be fulfilled is when it actually happens. And then we'll all be geniuses. We can all say this is that which was prophesied.
Exactly. Yeah.
What I can say now is this is beginning to look like that which is, well, it's beginning to look like we're getting close to when we can say that which is, this is that which was prophesied.
Well said. Well said.
Anyway, so listen, I'm doing a conference in a couple weeks. Last Day's Bible Conference, ldbc.ca. You can register there. There's, I think, a little registration fee. And I'm working on my talks. If the people from the conference are listening, I'm really trying. I had 3 hours of computer problems yesterday trying to figure out what was going on. You guys have a conference coming up too, don't you?
We do. Yeah. Proclaim the Way. It's going to be, what is it, June 6th? Is that right, Scott? I think that's the day. Yes. And so it'll be virtual. So we're going to be putting the link out really soon.
Yeah, I'm not going to Canada, by the way. I'm an American and I'm not allowed. So
yeah, I remember when we used to travel for conferences. That was fun. But anyway, this will be virtual. So it'll be right here on my channel. It's free for everybody. We're going to have a few door prizes. So you'll be able to potentially, win this book and a few others that we're going to be giving away. What's the basic topic? We're going to talk about, well, how, what is the relationship of the church to Israel? How does that work? With this whole thing we've been talking about, the Commonwealth of Israel, we're going to really explore that. And we're going to do it at the 101 level. Okay, so this is for newbies. People say, wait, something is missing in my theology. What is it? We hope that we can answer that. So we hope you can all join us for that, and we'll certainly get that link out to you very soon.
Who's going to be with you guys on that one?
Scott Harwell, Ed Doss, Doug Krieger, Chris Steinley, and Gavin Finley. So it'll be probably about a 6-hour conference. Should be great. Yeah.
With some questions and answers and everything. So
Indeed.
I think we're all trying to keep our talks to about 50 minutes. And
I have to do my Canadian conference. They gave me 40 minutes. 40 minutes. Wow. That's short for me.
Yeah. My problem is just trying to, kind of like a lawyer, John, is trying to look at all the verses that show these distinctions between the house of Judah and the house of Israel and the prophecies and everything, and just say, okay, I've got to pick like the best 20 to 30 and maybe just have a Word doc that anybody can go and look at all the distinctions.
Well, we hope you guys can join us. If you don't know, every Saturday we have, or I'm teaching on Sabbath teaching. So we hope you can join us for that. The Way Congregation right here on this channel. And every Tuesday, if you have a question, sometimes I see there's questions in the chat directed toward me specifically about something else in the Bible. Join me on Tuesday right here on this channel, and I will be glad to take your question. Thank you for tuning in, everyone. Until next time, may the Lord bless.